Hello, fourth graders. Welcome to session 2 of our SSGS unit on changemakers. Today we're going to be asking ourselves, how and why might people view the same event differently? And as we read about history, something we also want to think about is, what are all of these little facts we're reading about, that is, add up to a big idea? You're going to find a think sheet in your paper journal that looks like this. And you'll notice that there's a big idea box at the top, which we'll actually fill out last, and there's detail boxes below. So I'm going to model for you in a little bit as I read how I pause every now and then and jot down some details that stand out. But then at the end, the powerful piece is looking over all the details and determining what's one big idea I can write as a result of all of these little details. So every now and then as I'm reading, I'm going to want to stop and think about those facts and then react and say to myself, what is this telling me? What is the big idea really going on here? I'm going to demonstrate this for you with this text called The Split History, that is, of the American Revolution. It's kind of an interesting book because you can see the red-coated soldiers on the top and the blue-coated soldiers on the bottom, but their portion's a little smaller. But if I flip the book, notice how the blue-coated soldiers are larger on this cover and the red-coated soldiers are smaller on this cover. This is because it's a perspectives flip book. We're going to learn both perspectives of one event. The blue side is the Patriot perspective. When we flip it over, we see red with the red-coated soldiers, and that is going to give us the British perspective. So that's going to help us to say, why might people view the same event differently? We're probably thinking about the Patriots and the British, right? Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the Patriot side. It was August 14th, 1765. Across Boston, several thousand angry people poured out into the streets. Shouts of liberty, property with no stamps filled the air. The marchers were furious about the Stamp Act, a new law that had taxed paper goods and documents of all kind. That night, enraged protesters burned a straw effigy of Andrew Oliver. He was the unlucky official picked to collect the taxes. A mob also tore down a building that Oliver owned, and then headed to his home and wrecked furniture there. More destruction followed in the days to come. If I pause to think right there, I'm getting a real sense that the Patriots are angry about the Stamp Act, which, while it's called a Stamp Act, it's really a stamp tax. But why are they so angry about it? Why are they being destructive to his home? I'm going to keep that in mind as I keep reading. The Stamp Act of 1765 was part of a new policy for the 13 American colonies, one that drove many colonists to protest Britain rule. Leading the fight against the policy were American colonists known as patriots. Some of us think of patriots, we might think of the football team. However, back in American Revolution time, the patriots were those that were American colonists and who were starting to get fed up with the England and British rule. They challenged British efforts to raise taxes and squash the colonists' freedom. The Patriots' ideas and actions put the colonies and Great Britain on the road to war. So we're starting to really see that conflict brewing. It starts so far with this Stamp Act, but let's see if we can learn more. But the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain grew tense after 1763. That year, the British won the French and Indian War, in which Great Britain battled France for control of North America. I'm going to pause my reading here to remind you of yesterday's session when we watched a video that is about the French and Indian War. And we remembered learning about that, and that was why Britain asked them to start paying the taxes in the first place, because they had to pay back the debt from that war. I'm going to carry that knowledge forward as I continue reading. Britain's victory gave it control of Canada and the eastern half of what became the United States. The war had been costly, and British officials demanded that colonists help pay for the future defense of the colony. So if they wanted the British Army, sounds like they're going to have to start paying these taxes. That gives me a little understanding of maybe why there were taxes in the first place. So I'm going to write that detail down. So the taxes were set up to pay down the debt from the French Indian War. In 1764, Parliament passed the American Revenue Act, known as the Sugar Act. It taxed goods including sugar, wine, coffee, and some types of cloth. The Sugar Act was the first law to raise new money in the colonies. Many merchants believed that the new taxes would hurt their businesses. The Americans cherished the British tradition that gave people the right to approve the taxes that they paid. They did this through the representatives that they elected to Parliament or colonial legislatures. To understand that in American terms, that would mean that they did this through representatives they elected to the government, right, to the presidency or to Congress and Senate. So just to give you a picture of what that looked like back in American Revolution times, here was Parliament, and the big thing that the colonists were struggling with was that there was no one in this group of deciding factors from the 13 colonies. So that's starting to give us a little understanding of why they're so angry. So I might put that down as my next detail. So nobody was speaking up for them on their behalf. So the colonies, however, had no voting representatives in Parliament, and more Americans began to protest against taxation without representation. It says in 1766, Parliament repealed or took back the Stamp Act, but new taxes soon followed. The first of what came to be known as the Townshend Acts. It taxed glass, paper, paint, and tea imported from Britain. So things that were shipped from Britain to the colonies, they had to pay extra for, and that extra money went back to Britain. Some colonial merchants protested, that is, with a boycott of British goods. So sounds like more taxes were passed, which we have, like, it was the Townshend Act. And as a result, the colonists began boycotting British goods. They even, so things that were shipped to them, they even started smuggling them in. So smuggling, they talk about this down here. Boston was a center of the anger of all these new laws. British officials in Boston were clamping down on smuggling. So kind of going along with boycotting, which means I'm not going to buy it, they also began smuggling them in to their cities, which basically means they were hiding it. Therefore, they weren't paying for that extra tax. And so it says down here, on June 10th, 1768, the crew of a British warship seized a ship owned by Patriot merchant store owner, John Hancock, who was known for smuggling tea and molasses into the city. Britain seized or captured his ship because they were mad. It was his punishment. A crowd gathered to protest. Fists flew as the Americans beat up the British officials, leaving even one of them bloody. So there's this last big detail, is that, so we learned that Boston captured a smuggler's boat, which then led to a fight in Boston. So now it's really getting tense. As I wrap up that reading, the idea here is to say, if I look back over these details, what can I draw as one big idea? So if I look back over it, the Patriots were angry about the Stamp Act, which is basically a stamp tax. The taxes were set up to pay down the debt from the French and Indian War. There were no colonists in Parliament, the government, making these laws. More taxes were passed. Colonists began boycotting and smuggling in British goods. Britain then captured a smuggler's boat, which led to a fight in Boston. So if I think about this chain of events, so the colonists were angry that they didn't have any representation in Parliament, the British government. Okay, now it's your turn. You're going to look for this paper think sheet inside your paper journal, And near that will also be the scanned in pages from this book. Now, we just read the Patriots perspective. You're going to have the pages in your paper booklet of the British perspective. So you will see these 2 pages and these 2 pages. So your job today is to read these 4 pages, and in the middle of that, every now and then, remember to stop, think, and react. Jot down some details that pop out that help to explain the British perspective. If it helps, you might even want to also write British perspective up there as a reminder for yourself, thinking through the lens of the British. At the end of reading those 4 pages, look over your details and jot down one big idea statement. What is the British perspective on this same event? Just as a reminder, here is, and you can pause the video here, here is what we wrote down about the colonists' perspective. Remember, they were angry that they didn't have any representation in Parliament. There were many taxes coming down, laws enforced on them, that they didn't have anyone to speak up on their behalf in Parliament. So off you go.